So this is not your traditional Mother's Day video, and if that's what you're looking for, you may want to scroll on. I'm calling this video Matriarchy Rising. But I will say there's nothing wrong with the traditional version of Mother's Day, and to all who celebrate, Happy Mother's Day. To all who will go to church today and receive your white rose, I hope it's a joyous day. But somewhere in my deconstructing journey, where I was deconstructing before I knew I was deconstructing, I really started to dread those Mother's Day events at church. And this may not be your experience, so if it's not about you, then it's not for you. But there were a lot of women silently enduring the ritual of honoring the mothers that were strictly defined as women who had borne children. And I couldn't help but see the faces of the women who chose not to attend church because the day was so painful for them. From the woman who was overcome with grief because of the passing of her own mother, to the woman incapable of having the children she so desperately wanted. And each year she was watching these flowers pass by, and it was just going to be one more year that she had to do that. To the woman who didn't feel safe to come out to a church family that would tell her that her lifestyle was a sin in God's eyes. And of course, there's the woman who never wants to have children, but they do so much good in the world, working with children, rescuing unwanted pets, cleaning a neighbor's lawn, and so on and so forth. It's all mixed up in this day, and it's not to take away from anybody who celebrates Mother's Day that may be meaningful to you in a traditional sense. But two things can be true, and for me, not knowing I was deconstructing, but resisting some of those rituals that were actually hurtful to people was just one way that I was starting to deconstruct without knowing it. But let's also be honest, the Mother's Day in 2026 is far removed from the Mother's Day Anna Jarvis desired. She certainly didn't see it becoming a commercial holiday, but you give Americans enough time and we will always figure out how to blanket the most sacred of events with capitalism. And Mother's Day is no exception. But Jarvis intended it to be a day to honor her mother and women who worked on health and community and healing. It's interesting that Jarvis, the founder of Mother's Day, became the day's strongest critic because of what it had become. And that's where we enter the matriarchy. So somewhere in my deconstructing journey, I began questioning everything I had been taught and how it had shaped what I believed and who I was. And in some ways, I had no choice. I felt as if instead of this solid foundation, my life had been supported by weak scaffolding. It crashed loudly and spectacularly around me. It just kept swirling in me that if what church taught me wasn't true, what else in my life wasn't true? None of that happened overnight. It's taken years, and it will continue for the rest of my life. But when I began to deconstruct, I started working on my subservience to a social framework that prioritized Christian male leadership. I began to see how this impacted my self-worth and how often I willingly silenced myself to be compliant and viewed as the good, godly, obedient Christian woman. I cringe even saying that, not only because of how it impacted me, but how often I modeled that for younger eyes watching me, minimizing my worth for the God-blessed order of male leadership in all things, home, business, church, you name it. And within that fundamentalist Christian framework, if matriarchy had ever been mentioned, I certainly don't remember it. If it had been, it most certainly would have been about teachings that maligned its structure because it was defiant of God's natural and biblical order. Now, we could easily veer into talking about the empowered Christian woman in positions of leadership, and I know those air quotes are doing a lot of work because I'm thinking about the way women were used in church on stage and in executive church roles and women directing programs and so on. But it is all cosplay because there isn't one woman who's going to be elevated to any position of influence inside a fundamentalist conservative environment without her being 100% compliant and obedient to Christian patriarchy. She is not a threat. She is a useful and compliant tool. Now that is a whole proverbial rabbit hole that I talk about a lot, but let's just focus on matriarchy because it is being discussed in many spaces as an alternative to the Christian patriarchy that is under great strain to hold on to its power. But to get to this point, you must have a basic understanding of certain terms. And for some of you, this may feel overwhelming, especially if you are like many others, you believe that matriarchy is just patriarchy replaced by women in power. And it's nothing like that. So as we continue to navigate through the crisis within our nation, Mother's Day feels like the appropriate time to offer education and an invitation to expand our consciousness about the power, wisdom, and role of women within our humanity. Once we do so, it becomes evident why the fragility of a structure that relies on intimidation, gaslighting, and even abuse, such as Christian patriarchy, fears the awakening of women stepping into their power and the rise of matriarchy. So let's have a little Matriarchy 101. What I'm about to say is simply an overview. There are resources that I'll link in my Substack that you can find, but for some basic definitions, at its root, the word matriarchy literally means rule of mothers, although actually being a mother isn't the primary requirement for women in leadership within a matriarchal structure. It means a system in which women hold a birthright to rule, in which power in government, religion, law, and social structure belongs to women because they are women. The women will determine the laws, they shape the cultural norms, they control the institutions, and ultimately decide how power is distributed. Yes, they could choose to distribute that power, but the power would still originate with the women. Let's pause, because this overly simplified definition of matriarchy may lead you to conclude that matriarchy is the mirror version of patriarchy, but you need to keep listening, because the subtext of matriarchal societies is where we find the true gift and wisdom of matriarchy, unlike those found in patriarchal structure. This is just an overview from a deconstructing, unchurched, no longer Christian woman, but I want to provide a little bit more context. Let's talk about matrilineal societies. In a matrilineal society, lineage, inheritance, and identity pass through the mother's line. This can look like property being handed down from mother to daughter, or children taking on the identity of their mother's family. But lineage is not the same as power, but it may be an indicator of how power is established. Now, in matrilocal societies, a husband moves into the wife's family's home or community. This creates stability and continuity for women, but again, proximity is not the same as authority. So what is a matrifocal culture? It's where the mother is the center of the family or community and provides emotional, social, and sometimes spiritual support. Within these cultures, they deeply respect women and even honor feminine life-giving energy, but reverence does not automatically translate into structural control or power. And this is why it's so important to the history of matriarchal societies as taught by those who know the stories of their ancestors. So within those resources, you will find a suggested reading list from an educator of matriarchy by the name of Nergis, and they teach on Substack and is crowdfunding for her upcoming book. So spend time learning about the ancient tribes who had some type of matriarchal structure within their tribes. And within each of these societies, women played meaningful roles. They controlled land. They passed down lineage, they selected the leaders, or they were the anchor of the family structure. Each society may have operated differently, but what is clear is that women were respected and they held influence over decisions that influenced the well-being of their tribes or people. There has been an attempt to label ancient matriarchal structures as something other than matriarchy. Many people label these societies as egalitarian or at times as a partnership culture, a system where power is not concentrated in one gender, but distributed in ways that allow both to contribute, lead, and influence in different yet interdependent ways. But that feels like a relabeling for the sake of assuaging those who may be intimidated by a structure that elevates and empowers women to their rightful place in society. I believe that we, the ones who are deconstructing from the patriarchal indoctrinations that not only harmed us, but also benefited us, we are not in a position to negotiate the language surrounding the rising consciousness of matriarchy. What I sense is happening is there is a resistance to accepting that education is needed to understand matriarchy. But our patriarchal structure is deeply entrenched in resisting any type of learning from women, especially Black and brown women who carry the wisdom of their ancestors. It benefits them to continue the narrative that matriarchy is merely women ruling over men. And of course, based on our experience with patriarchy, that sounds threatening. Of course, it sounds like oppression simply flipped in the other direction. But here's the thing. What the research actually shows is something very different. Across cultures, when women gain access to education, resources, and decision-making power, societies tend to become more stable, more equitable, and less violent. Is anybody really surprised? Families invest more in long-term well-being like education, health, sustainability. Communities become more collaborative, not more controlling. In other words, nothing like patriarchy. So, when you hear me say matriarchy rising, we are not saying we need women dominance as structured within the framework of patriarchy. That is not what we're saying at all. We're saying we need a world where power is no longer built on control, hierarchy, and exclusion. We need a system that feels more human, more sustainable, more just. And maybe part of that work, especially for those of us healing from systems that taught us to fear anything outside of male authority, is learning to desire its return, not as a threat, but as a return to balance, a return to the wisdom of the ancestors, a coming home to the mother. May it be so. And now, to all who celebrate Mother's Day, may you be a part of the collective consciousness awakening so that women are honored for the multitude of ways they bring life into the world. And claim your white rose, whether it's in person or symbolically. Happy Mother's Day. You can find this writing on Substack, and please support my work by following me on all my social media platforms.